Marco Santini was 23 years old when he made the choice that would define the rest of his life. The date was September 10, 1943. The location was a small town outside Naples, Italy. And the choice was whether to remain loyal to the Italian army, which had just surrendered to the Allies, or to join the German forces that were occupying Italy and conscripting Italian soldiers into their service. He chose wrong. Or he chose right, depending on how you looked at it, depending on what came after. Marco had been drafted into the Italian army in 1941. He'd spent 2 years serving in North Africa and Sicily, watching Italian military leadership make increasingly desperate decisions and watching Italian soldiers die for reasons that nobody could quite articulate. By September 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allies, Marco was an experienced soldier who understood that Italy had lost the war. He was also trapped. The German army, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had anticipated an Italian surrender and had already positioned troops throughout Italy. When the Italian government announced the surrender, the Germans moved quickly to disarm Italian forces, occupy Italian territory, and conscript Italian soldiers into their service. Italian soldiers faced a unique and brutal situation. They were technically soldiers of the German army, but they were also nationals of a country that Germany was now occupying and exploiting. They were not trusted. They were not integrated into German units. Instead, they were placed into separate battalions of Italian soldiers under German command. These units were called the Italian Wehrmacht battalions, or more informally, the Italian auxiliary troops. There were approximately 50,000 Italian soldiers in these battalions by 1944. Most of them were conscripted against their will. Most of them were not loyal to the German cause, and most of them were treated worse than regular German soldiers, but not much better than prisoners of war. Marco's battalion was assigned to garrison duties in central Italy. They were supposed to guard supply lines and maintain order in occupied territory. In practice, they were used for the dirtiest jobs: digging fortifications, cleaning latrines, carrying supplies, working in dangerous conditions, while German soldiers did the more prestigious military work. The Italian soldiers in Marco's battalion were paid less than German soldiers. They were given worse food. They were subjected to harsh discipline from German officers who viewed them with contempt. Some German officers ordered executions of Italian soldiers who disobeyed orders or tried to desert. The message was clear: you are conscripted, you are not trusted, and you will do what you're told or die. Marco survived in this environment by keeping his head down, doing his work, and trying to remain invisible. He was good at it. He'd learned those skills in the chaos of the North African campaign. He knew how to read situations, how to anticipate danger, and how to avoid drawing attention from officers who might use him for dangerous work. But keeping your head down when you're a conscripted Italian soldier in the German army is a precarious existence. You're never safe. You're always one wrong decision away from being ordered to do something suicidal or being executed for suspected disloyalty. By early 1944, Marco had spent 6 months as a German soldier. He'd become hardened to the routine of military occupation. He'd made peace with his choice, or at least accepted it. He was alive, he was fed, he was not in combat. Those were reasonable objectives for survival. But the situation was about to change in ways that Marco couldn't have anticipated. By spring 1944, the American army was advancing northward through Italy. The German defensive lines were being pushed back. Supply lines were being disrupted. The Italian soldiers in Marco's battalion were being moved around constantly to respond to American advances. Marco's battalion was pulled back from garrison duties and assigned to frontline defensive positions. This was worse than garrison work. Frontline positions meant combat. Combat meant casualties. Combat meant that Marco might actually have to fight against the Americans. The thought of this filled him with conflict. He was Italian. The Americans were fighting against German occupation of Italy. In some part of his mind, Marco understood that the Americans were technically the good guys. The Germans were occupying his country, but he was wearing a German uniform. He was carrying a German rifle. He was part of the German army. If he encountered American soldiers, he would be expected to fight them. The first American attack came on May 12, 1944, near the town of Cassino. The Americans attacked a ridge position that Marco's battalion was defending. American artillery pounded the position for hours. Then American infantry attacked from multiple directions. Marco had never experienced American firepower before. The volume of fire was overwhelming. American machine guns laid down suppressive fire while American soldiers advanced. American artillery shifted from the ridge to support the infantry assault. It was coordinated, professional, and utterly devastating to the Italian soldiers defending the position. The Italian battalion broke under the assault. Some soldiers were killed, some were wounded, some tried to retreat and were cut down by American fire, and some, including Marco, surrendered. When Marco dropped his rifle and put his hands up, he was making another choice. He was betraying the German army that had conscripted him. He was surrendering to the Americans. He was ending his service as a German soldier, and he was putting his fate into the hands of an enemy. The American soldiers who captured Marco were initially suspicious. He was wearing a German uniform. He was carrying a German rifle. But when he spoke to them in Italian-accented English, they understood what had happened. He was a conscripted Italian soldier who had been forced into the German army. The American soldiers treated him with indifference. He wasn't killed. He wasn't beaten. He was simply disarmed, searched, and placed with the other prisoners. Marco thought the worst was over. He'd survived combat. He'd escaped the German army. He was a prisoner, yes, but prisoners were supposed to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. He should be safe. But what he didn't know was that his capture was just the beginning of a series of experiences that would fundamentally change how he understood loyalty, betrayal, and humanity. The American soldiers escorted Marco and the other prisoners to a temporary prisoner collection point. There were about 200 prisoners, a mix of German and Italian soldiers. They were placed in a barbed wire enclosure with basic shelter but no real facilities. Marco expected harsh treatment. He had been trained to believe that Americans were brutal, that they would execute prisoners or torture them for information. This was part of the propaganda that German officers had been feeding Italian soldiers throughout the war. The Americans were enemies. They were capable of anything. What Marco experienced instead was shocking in its ordinariness. An American officer came to the prisoner enclosure and asked if anyone could speak English. Marco stepped forward. The officer asked for basic information: names, ranks, units. He explained that the prisoners would be transported to a more permanent camp. He said that prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. He said that anyone who tried to escape would be shot, but otherwise they would be safe. The tone was professional, not cruel, not threatening, just matter of fact. Over the next few days, as Marco and the other prisoners were transported northward toward the main prisoner of war camp, something happened that Marco had not expected. The American soldiers shared their rations with the prisoners. An American soldier gave Marco a chocolate bar, just like that. Marco had not eaten chocolate in years. The chocolate was American chocolate, sweeter and richer than anything Italian manufacturers produced. Marco ate it slowly, trying to make it last, not quite believing that an American soldier had simply given it to him. Other prisoners were also receiving rations from American soldiers: coffee, cigarettes, sometimes even small portions of meat. The Americans were not supposed to be doing this. There were regulations about fraternizing with prisoners. But the American soldiers seemed to have made a collective decision that the rules were worth bending a little. One American soldier, a sergeant named John from somewhere in the Midwest, spent time talking with Marco. The sergeant's Italian was worse than Marco's English, but I managed to communicate. The sergeant asked about Marco's family. He asked where Marco was from. He asked about what it was like to be conscripted into the German army. "Why?" Marco asked. "Why are you being nice to me? I was your enemy." "You were wearing a German uniform," the sergeant said. "But you're Italian. Your country surrendered a year ago. You didn't want to be here any more than I want to be here. You got drafted into the wrong army. That's not your fault." This kind of thinking was so far into Marco that he struggled to process it. In the Italian army, soldiers were expected to be loyal to their commanders and their country without question. In the German army, soldiers were expected to be loyal to the Nazi regime and German superiority without question. The idea that an American soldier would extend kindness to a prisoner based on the understanding that the prisoner was a victim of circumstance rather than a true enemy was alien to Marco's experience. When Marco arrived at the main POW camp, located in southern Italy near Bari, he expected conditions to get worse. Permanent camps were supposed to have better security, which meant more restrictions and less freedom. Marco expected that the kindness of individual American soldiers would disappear once he was in an official camp run by military regulations. Instead, he found that the experience at the collection point was representative of how the Americans actually operated. The camp was large, holding approximately 5,000 prisoners, divided into separate sections for German prisoners and Italian prisoners. The camp had barracks, latrines, kitchens, and a medical facility. Water was available, sanitation was maintained, prisoners were fed 3 times a day with rations that, while not luxurious, were adequate and regular. This was not a luxury resort. Prisoners were confined. They had limited freedom. They could not leave the camp. They were subject to military discipline. But they were also not starving. They were not being tortured. They were not being executed for minor infractions. By the standards of military imprisonment, it was remarkably humane. Marco's duties in the camp included working on maintenance and supply details. He worked under the direction of American soldiers and American Army civilians, all of whom treated him with professional courtesy. The American officers and sergeants issued orders, but they did so without excessive harshness or cruelty. More importantly, the American soldiers continued to interact with the prisoners in a way that Marco found shocking. They would trade cigarettes for artwork that prisoners created. They would share extra rations with prisoners who were sick. They would engage in conversations with prisoners about life before the war. They treated the prisoners like they were people, not like they were animals or objects. This was particularly apparent in how the Americans handled an incident involving an Italian prisoner who became seriously ill. The prisoner developed pneumonia. The camp doctor, an American officer, treated the prisoner with the same care he would have given to an American soldier. Antibiotics were used. The prisoner was transferred to a hospital unit for more intensive care. The prisoner survived. When Marco asked an American medic why they were spending resources treating an Italian prisoner who was technically an enemy, the medic looked confused by the question. "He's a human being," he said simply. "He's sick. We treat sick people. That's what we do." Over the next several months, as Marco spent time in the POW camp, he began to understand something that went deeper than simple kindness or humanitarian treatment. He began to understand that the Americans operated according to a different set of assumptions about what humans owed to each other. The chocolate remained a symbol for this for Marco. American soldiers would occasionally give prisoners chocolate bars or other treats from their rations. This was technically against regulations. Prisoners were supposed to eat camp food only, but the regulations were often ignored, and American soldiers would share. To Marco, this sharing of chocolate had enormous significance. Chocolate was a luxury. It was expensive. It was something that American soldiers could have kept for themselves, but they shared it. They shared it with prisoners. They shared it with potential enemies. Marco came to understand that this sharing was not about the chocolate itself, it was about something larger. It was about a different way of understanding the relationship between people. It was about treating everyone as fundamentally deserving of dignity and basic kindness, regardless of uniform or nationality, or whether they had been on opposite sides of a conflict. In his later post-war reflections, which Marco recorded in a series of interviews with an Italian historian in the 1970s, he tried to articulate what the chocolate had meant. He said that when the American soldier gave me the chocolate, I thought it was pity. I thought he was feeling sorry for me because I was a prisoner and hungry. But it wasn't pity. It was something else. It was a kind of recognition. A recognition that I was a human being, that I was a person who could appreciate chocolate just like he could, and that even though we were technically enemies, there was something more fundamental than that. We were both just men. He went on to explain how this was different from his experience in the Italian army and in the German army. He said that in the Italian army, soldiers were treated as soldiers. We were expected to follow orders and be loyal to the state. In the German army, soldiers were expected to be loyal to the Nazi regime and German superiority without question. But in the American army, at least as represented by the soldiers I encountered, there was an assumption that even prisoners were still people, that we deserved to be treated with basic dignity, that giving me chocolate was not an act of pity, but an act of recognition that I was a human being worthy of basic kindness. As months passed in the POW camp, Marco began to confront the reality of what he had done. He had been conscripted into the German army. He had fought for Germany, even though his heart wasn't in it. And then, he had surrendered to the Americans without a real fight. From a German perspective, this was betrayal. From an Italian nationalist perspective, this could be seen as a form of collaboration. He had served the occupying power. From his own perspective, it was survival. But the American soldiers and officers treated him in a way that suggested they didn't care about the betrayal aspect. They didn't treat him as a traitor or a collaborator. They treated him as a prisoner of war. They treated him as a person who had gotten caught up in circumstances beyond his control. This created an internal conflict for Marco. He felt guilty for having served in the German army. He felt guilty for having been willing to potentially fight against his own people if ordered to do so. But the Americans, through their treatment of him, seemed to be suggesting that he shouldn't feel guilty, that his circumstances were understandable, that he didn't deserve punishment or contempt for having been conscripted. In one interview from the 1970s, Marco reflected on this conflict. "I asked myself many times if I was a traitor. I had worn a German uniform. I had taken an oath to the German army. Even though I didn't want to be there, I was there. And then I surrendered. I gave up without fighting as hard as I could have. Was that betrayal? Was I betraying Germany by surrendering? Was I betraying Italy by having served in the German army in the first place?" The American soldiers and officers never made me feel like I had to answer those questions in a particular way. They treated me as if these questions were complicated and understandable, and not something for which I should be condemned. This was different from my experience with other armies, where you are expected to be certain about your loyalty and to never question it. To understand Marco's experience fully, it's important to understand the broader context of how different armies treated prisoners during World War II. The German army treated prisoners according to its own rules, which were often brutal. Soviet prisoners were treated with particular harshness, reflecting Nazi ideology about Soviet communism and racial hierarchies. Italian prisoners in German hands were often treated as second-class soldiers, with limited rights and rations. The Italian army had largely collapsed by 1943, so there was limited documentation of how Italian soldiers treated prisoners. But Italian military tradition generally followed European conventions about prisoner treatment. The American army treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, which provided for basic protection and humane treatment. American army regulations explicitly stated that prisoners were to be treated humanely. Torture was prohibited. Executions of prisoners were prohibited. Prisoners were to be given adequate food, water, and medical care. In practice, American enforcement of these regulations varied. Some American units followed the regulations strictly. Some American units were more flexible. But the general standard across American forces was significantly more humane than the German standard. Marco's experience reflected this. He was treated according to Geneva Convention standards. He was not tortured. He was not starved. He was not executed. He was given basic medical care, and individual American soldiers went beyond the minimum standards by sharing their rations and treating prisoners with personal kindness. When the war ended in May 1945, Marco was still in the prisoner of war camp. He'd spent over a year in American captivity. He'd adapted to camp life. He'd learned English better. He'd made friends with other Italian prisoners, and he'd begun to process what had happened to him. The question now was what would happen next. Marco was Italian. Italy was no longer an enemy. Italy was in fact changing from an Axis power to an allied co-belligerent. Italian prisoners of war were supposed to be repatriated to Italy after the war ended. But before repatriation, Marco had to confront the question of what his status was. Had he been a German soldier, in which case he might face prosecution for war crimes or collaboration? Or had he been a conscripted Italian soldier who was forced into the German army? The answer determined what kind of repatriation he would receive. The American authorities determined that Marco had been conscripted against his will and was not responsible for war crimes. He was classified as a prisoner of war who would be repatriated to Italy. He was not prosecuted, he was not punished, he was simply allowed to go home. In July 1945, Marco left the prisoner of war camp for the last time. He was transported to a port in Italy and put on a ship back to his home. As he left, American soldiers said goodbye. Some of them gave him cigarettes or candy for the journey. One of them, Sergeant John, shook his hand and wished him well. Marco returned to Italy and to a life as a civilian. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. He got a job working in construction. He married. He raised a family. He lived a quiet, ordinary life. But he never forgot what had happened to him during the war. And he never forgot the chocolate. In the 1970s, when Marco was in his 50s and his wartime experiences were becoming historical rather than immediate, he agreed to be interviewed about his experiences. The Italian historian who interviewed him was interested in the experiences of Italian soldiers who had been conscripted into the German army. This was a neglected part of Italian history, a painful chapter that many Italians preferred not to discuss. Marco was willing to talk because he felt that his story had meaning. His story was about betrayal and collaboration, and the impossible choices that ordinary people face during war. His story was also about the possibility of humanity in the midst of war. His story was about how treating people with basic kindness and dignity could change the way they understood the world. When asked what he had learned from his experience, Marco reflected carefully. I asked myself many times if I was a traitor. I had worn a German uniform. I had taken an oath to the German army. Even though I didn't want to be there, I was there. And then I surrendered. I gave up without fighting as hard as I could have. Was that betrayal? Was I betraying Germany by surrendering? Was I betraying Italy by having served in the German army in the first place? The American soldiers and officers never made me feel like I had to answer those questions in a particular way. They treated me as if these questions were complicated and understandable, and not something for which I should be condemned. This was different from my experience with other armies, where you were expected to be certain about your loyalty and to never question it. The chocolate they shared with me was not really about chocolate. It was about recognition. Recognition that I was a human being. That was the most important thing I learned during the war. Not tactics, or military strategy, or nationalism, but the fundamental importance of treating people with basic humanity.
What made Marco's experience with American soldiers significant was that it represented a different approach to warfare and to enemies. The Americans didn't hate Italian soldiers or German soldiers in any personal sense. They had been sent to fight them because it was a war. But they didn't extend that military conflict into personal cruelty or dehumanization. This was not universal among American soldiers. Some American units committed atrocities. Some American soldiers were cruel to prisoners. But the general standard across the American Army was professionalism and adherence to established rules of conduct, which included treating prisoners humanely. This was in contrast to the German Army, which explicitly rejected Geneva Convention protections for certain categories of prisoners and engaged in systematic brutality. It was in contrast to Japanese forces, which treated prisoners with extreme cruelty. It was in contrast to Soviet forces, which treated captured German soldiers with brutality in retaliation for German brutality toward Soviet prisoners. The American approach, professional, rule-based, humane, represented a different philosophy about how war should be conducted. For Marco, this difference had profound psychological and emotional significance. It allowed him to process his war experience not as a story of shame and betrayal, but as a story of survival and eventual redemption. It allowed him to understand that his service in the German army had not permanently compromised his humanity. It allowed him to move forward with his life without carrying the full weight of guilt that might otherwise have crushed him. Marco's experience, while individual, was part of a larger pattern. Approximately 600,000 Italian soldiers were conscripted into German service after Italy's surrender in 1943. Most of them served reluctantly. Most of them did not identify with the Nazi cause. Many of them deserted or surrendered when they had the opportunity. American forces, as they advanced through Italy and later through Germany, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The American Army's general approach was to treat these prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, which meant they were fed, sheltered, and given medical care. This was not purely altruistic. The American Army had practical reasons for treating prisoners well. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to cause problems. Well-treated prisoners could provide useful information about enemy positions and intentions. And the American Army was aware that its own soldiers might eventually be captured and would therefore want to ensure that captured Americans were treated well in return. But there was also a philosophical element. The American military leadership believed that the United States was fighting for values, democracy, freedom, human dignity, and that these values should extend to how enemies were treated. You couldn't claim to be fighting for human rights while denying basic humanity to prisoners. This philosophy was reflected in the Geneva Convention standards and in the regulations that American soldiers were given about prisoner treatment. It was also reflected in individual American soldiers' decisions to treat prisoners with personal kindness beyond what was strictly required. For Italian conscripts like Marco, this approach had enormous significance. It meant the difference between being treated as a human being and being treated as an object of contempt. It meant the difference between hope and despair. It meant the difference between a post-war life of guilt and shame and a post-war life where redemption was possible. In Marco's later reflections, he kept returning to the chocolate. It seemed like a small thing, a piece of candy. But for Marco, it represented something profound about American culture and American values. Americans, in the popular imagination, were thought to be materialistic and selfish. This was part of German and Italian propaganda about American society. Americans were thought to care only about money and consumption. They were thought to be incapable of sacrifice or idealism. But the chocolate suggested something different. American soldiers, who came from a wealthy country with abundant food, chose to share that abundance with prisoners. They weren't forced to do this by their officers. They chose to do it. They chose to recognize the humanity of prisoners and to extend basic kindness. For Marco, this suggested that American culture, despite its materialism, had a foundation of basic human decency. Americans might be interested in money and consumption, but they also believed in treating people fairly and with dignity. They believed that human relationships should be grounded in respect, not just military hierarchy or national enmity. This understanding would shape how Marco understood America for the rest of his life. He never visited America. He never learned more about American culture than what he observed from the American soldiers he encountered. But his basic impression of America was positive based on his experience of American kindness and professionalism. In his final interview before his death in 1983, Marco was asked if he harbored any resentment toward Americans for having fought against Italy. His answer was simple. No. The Americans were soldiers doing their job. They were professional about it. And when I was in their power, they treated me with dignity and kindness. What more could I ask? They could have treated me with cruelty. They could have executed me. Instead, they gave me chocolate and treated me like a human being. How could I possibly resent that? Near the end of Marco's life, he wrote a letter to Sergeant John, the American soldier who had spoken with him kindly during his transport to the POW camp. Marco didn't know if John was still alive. He didn't even know John's last name or how to reach him. But he wrote the letter anyway, as a way of expressing gratitude for what John had done. The letter was never sent. Marco didn't know where to send it, but he kept it with his personal papers, and it was discovered after his death. The letter read, "Dear Sergeant John, I don't know if you're still alive or if you would even remember me. I was the Italian prisoner you were kind to when we were transported to the camp in 1944. You spoke to me in broken Italian, and you treated me like a human being, instead of an enemy. You gave me coffee and shared your cigarettes with me. I want you to know that what you did mattered. It mattered more than you probably realized at the time. I had been conscripted into the German army against my will. I felt shame and confusion about my status. I didn't know if I was a traitor or a victim of circumstances. You treated me in a way that suggested the answer. You treated me as if circumstances had put me in a bad situation, but I was still a fundamentally decent person who deserved kindness and respect. That made all the difference. I survived the war. I came home to Italy. I raised a family. I lived a good life. A lot of that was possible because I was able to process my wartime experiences in a way that didn't destroy me with guilt or shame. Your kindness helped make that possible. I know this is a long time after the war. I know you probably have your own life and your own experiences and your own memories that are more important than a wartime encounter with a prisoner. But I wanted you to know that what you did mattered. It mattered to me, and I've never forgotten your kindness. Thank you for being a decent human being during a time when the world was full of cruelty. Thank you for treating me like a person. Thank you for the chocolate and the coffee and the conversations. With gratitude and respect, Marco Santini."
Marco Santini's story is significant not because it describes dramatic military events or tactical innovations. It is significant because it documents what happens when ordinary people choose to act with humanity in the midst of war. Marco was a conscript who found himself in an impossible situation. He was drafted into the Italian army. He was then conscripted into the German army against his will. He eventually surrendered to the Americans. Each of these choices involved betrayal of some kind. Betrayal of neutral status when he was drafted into the Italian army, betrayal of Italy when he was conscripted into the German army, betrayal of Germany when he surrendered to the Americans. But the Americans, through their treatment of him, suggested that these choices were understandable and forgivable. They suggested that what mattered more than loyalty to nations or armies was basic human decency. They suggested that a person could be evaluated not on the basis of what uniform he wore, but on the basis of his fundamental humanity. This was a revolutionary idea for Marco, who had been raised in military cultures that demanded absolute loyalty and obedience. It was an idea that allowed him to move forward with his life without being consumed by guilt or shame. It was an idea that, through Marco's life and through the interviews he gave later, became part of the historical record. Marco's story is also a testament to the power of individual acts of kindness. A single American soldier sharing chocolate with a prisoner might seem like a small gesture, but for the prisoner, it could mean the difference between despair and hope. It could mean the difference between understanding yourself as fundamentally worthwhile or fundamentally worthless. The American soldiers who treated prisoners with kindness weren't doing it because they had been ordered to. They were doing it because they had made individual choices about how to behave when nobody was specifically watching or requiring them to behave in a particular way. These individual choices, multiplied across thousands of soldiers and prisoners, created a pattern that defined American military culture and American treatment of prisoners during World War II. This pattern was not universal. There were American soldiers who were cruel to prisoners. There were American units that committed atrocities. But the general standard across the American Army was professionalism, adherence to rules, and basic human decency. For prisoners like Marco, this difference was everything. It meant survival, yes, but more than that, it meant the possibility of psychological and spiritual survival. It meant the possibility of moving forward after the war without being destroyed by guilt or shame or resentment. Marco lived until 1983. He spent the last 40 years of his life as a civilian, putting the war behind him as much as possible. But he never forgot the chocolate. He never forgot the American soldiers who treated him with kindness. He never forgot that even in the midst of war, humans could choose to treat each other with dignity and respect. His story stands as a testament to the importance of that choice. And it serves as a reminder that military power and national interest, while important, are not the only values that matter. Human decency matters too.